If you're watching this video, there's a pretty good chance you've either tried chasing Pappy Van Winkle or you've realized chasing Pappy Van Winkle is basically the bourbon version of chasing Bigfoot. You hear stories, you see pictures, but in the wild, almost nobody actually gets their hands on it. And even if a bottle does show up, it's priced like it was discovered in a treasure chest at the bottom of the ocean. But here's the thing most people don't realize: the bourbon world has evolved. There are bottles out there, real bottles you can actually find that capture pieces of what makes Pappy so legendary. The soft wheat profile, the long aging influence, the deep oak, the velvety sweetness, the baking spice complexity. You don't have to spend $1,500 or win a lottery to taste something in that wheelhouse. So today we're diving deep into the very best alternatives to Pappy Van Winkle. Not hype bottles, not random weeders, but real historically grounded, stylistically accurate, flavor-driven bourbons that share roots techniques or flavor DNA with the Van Winkle style. Before we get started, make sure you like, subscribe, and tap that notification bell, because on this channel we go into bourbon history, production science, distillery secrets, and storytelling, and my own bourbon mystery novel, The $1 Million Barrel, is out now. I will include a link in the description below, so if you love whiskey lore, you're going to want to stick around. Alright, let's get into it. We're starting with a brand that has far more to do with the history of wheated bourbon than people realize, and that's Maker's Mark. A lot of newer bourbon drinkers think wheated bourbon became a thing when Pappy got big. But Maker's Mark was using red winter wheat long before Pappy became a cult favorite. In fact, Maker started producing wheated bourbon in the 1950s, decades before the Pappy Van Winkle brand itself became a household name in the bourbon world. Although it is rumored that Bill Samuels got the wheated recipe from Pappy himself while Pappy was still over Stitzel-Weller in the 1950s. But believe me, Maker's Mark will never tell you that on a tour. Maker's Mark was founded by Bill Samuels Sr., who famously burned his family's original rye-based recipe and rebuilt it from scratch. He and his wife, Margie Samuels, wanted a softer bourbon, sweeter, creamier, and smoother than the rye-heavy Kentucky bourbons of the 1940s and 50s. That's why they chose wheat, and that choice ultimately shaped the entire wheated bourbon category. Even the Van Winkle family has credited Maker's Mark as helping pave the way for modern wheated bourbon appreciation. Now, let's talk production, because this is where the similarities to Pappy get very real. Maker's Mark uses a 110 barrel entry proof, one of the lowest in the entire bourbon industry. That's the same philosophy the Van Winkles used when the family owned Stitzel-Weller back in the mid-20th century, producing some of the best bourbon for brands like Old Fitzgerald. Lower entry proof means more sugars dissolve from the wood, resulting in deeper vanilla, caramel, and baking spice, the very flavors that make Pappy famous today. Maker's also ages everything in heat-cycled warehouses, allowing aging to continue through the winter when other distilleries go dormant. This produces richer oak character at younger ages, similar to what the Van Winkle line is known for. As for flavor, Maker's Classic is 90 proof and around 6 years old, but the bottles that truly compete with Pappy are things like Maker's 101 proof, Maker's Cask Strength, Maker's 46 Cask Strength, and especially Maker's Mark Cellar Aged. These are richer, oakier, and much closer to the profile that a Pappy drinker is used to. Buttery caramel, deep vanilla, toasted oak, custard, warm baking spice, and that creamy wheat sweetness. Maker's Cask Strength comes in around a varying 110 proof, and the cellar aged usually reaches even higher, dense, rich, dessert-forward wheated bourbon that absolutely holds its own against bottles 5 times the price. I personally think the cellar aged is the closest you can get to Pappy without Buffalo Trace due to the higher age statement and similar proof points. So if you want a bourbon that checks nearly every Pappy box, the wheat, the low entry proof, the deep sweetness, Maker's Mark is the most historically consistent and accessible path. Next up is a bottle that honestly shocked a lot of people when it hit the market, been Holladay Rickhouse proof. This is one of the oldest distilling operations in America, dating back to 1856, predating many Kentucky distilleries. It's produced in Weston, Missouri, and the distillery became the first legally recognized producer of Missouri bourbon, a state-protected ingredient source category similar to how bourbon itself is protected at the federal level. But here's the part that bourbon nerds love. Ben Holladay follows a heritage production style extremely similar to traditional Kentucky wheated bourbon. They use wheat instead of rye, long fermentation times, proper sour mash technique, classic pot and column hybrid distillation, and heavy Missouri limestone influence, another nod to old school Van Winkle process. It's important to note as well that the distillery does produce non-wheat bourbons, but for this case I am talking about the wheated bourbons. And then you have the Rickhouse Proof Series. These are bottled exactly at the proof each barrel rests at in the Rickhouse. No dilution, no manipulation. Rickhouse proof batches typically land between 115 to 120 proof depending on the barrels. The age varies, but most are between 6 and 8 years, which is a little lower than the range where Pappy's younger expressions like Old Rip 10 and Van Winkle Lot B get their rich sweetness without overpowering oak. But don't let the younger whiskey fool you. The Rickhouse proofs are still my favorites to come out of the distillery, even with an average age statement. Flavor-wise, this is an absolute powerhouse wheated bourbon. Cornbread sweetness, honey, rich caramel, soft cinnamon, toasted oak, baked apple, and a creamy mid-palate that genuinely echoes the Pappy profile more than almost any other non-Buffalo Trace wheated bourbon on the market. Ben Holladay, Rickhouse Proof, and just the distillery in general is the real deal, and it's still under most people's radar. Now let's move to a brand with a revival story just as interesting as its flavor. Green River Wheated Bourbon. Green River Distillery in Owensboro, Kentucky was founded in 1885, and early on it was known as the whiskey without regrets. It won competitions all over the world before Prohibition knocked it off the map. For decades, the distillery sat in ruin until a massive restoration brought it roaring back to life in the late 2010s and early 2020s. Today, especially under the ownership of Bardstown Bourbon Company, Green River is one of the fastest growing distilleries in America, and their wheated bourbon has become an absolute sleeper hit, especially for a very reasonable price of around $35 to $40. Green River wheated typically comes in at 90 proof, aged around 5 to 6 years, but don't let that age fool you. This is one of the sweetest, most dessert-like wheaters you can buy without entering the Buffalo Trace insanity zone. They use a 115 entry proof, similar to Maker's Mark, and the result is a bourbon loaded with vanilla cream, baked apples, honey, marshmallow, shortbread cookies, soft oak, and a warm pastry sweetness. The wheat content softens every edge, creating an experience that mirrors the softness of something like Lot B or even younger Stitzel-Weller bourbons from the past. It's not trying to be a Pappy copycat. It just naturally shares that profile. Even though it's current, lower proof is really only comparable to Lot B since it's 90 proof. I can't wait for Green River to put out the single barrel full proof version of it with some possible store picks. But best of all, you can actually find it on shelves. And finally, the most obvious Pappy alternative, Weller Antique 107. But calling Weller a Pappy alternative is almost underselling it. Weller is literally the foundation that the Van Winkle line is built on. Let's talk history. William LaRue Weller began producing wheated bourbon way back in 1849, making him one of the earliest adopters of wheat in bourbon history. Fast forward to the mid-20th century and you get Stitzel-Weller, the distillery run by Julian Pappy Van Winkle, producing legendary wheated bourbons that are now considered some of the greatest ever made. When Buffalo Trace eventually took over production of the Weller line and the Van Winkle line, everything moved under one roof. That means today, Weller and Pappy share the same mash bill, the same yeast strain, the same fermentation methods, the same distillation, and the same warehouses. They literally age side by side. The only difference is barrel selection age and intended flavor profile. And I know what some of you may say, but I can't find 107. Well, normally I don't promote this, but if you absolutely cannot find one, they only go for $100 on secondary Weller 107. Typically lands right at 107 proof, obviously, and usually comes in at 7 to 8 years old, though that can vary. This is the sweet spot for wheated bourbon. Enough oak to give depth, not enough to dry it out. The flavor is absolutely classic. Dark fruit, cinnamon red hots, caramel, heavy vanilla, honey, toasted oak, and that signature chewy, warm, wheat-driven mid-palate. Old Rip 10 tastes closer to Weller 107 than it does to something like Pappy 23, since of course it's only 2 to 3 years older than 107. They're cousins, practically siblings, sometimes even twins depending on the barrels. I know this sounds crazy, but other than Pappy 15 or the Old Rip, I personally prefer the 107 over most of the Pappy line. It's not that I am being petty, I just don't think most of the lineup is 6 to 20 times better in price than the 107. If you want something that genuinely shares DNA with Pappy, Weller 107 is the surest path. So those are the best real alternatives to Pappy Van Winkle, not gimmicks, not hype pieces, but bourbons with real historical connection, real flavor overlap, and real production similarities. Maker's Mark gives you the original wheated bourbon blueprint and modern oak-driven finishes. Ben Holladay Rickhouse Proof gives you old school techniques with big flavor and serious heritage. Green River Wheated gives you a sweet, accessible, classic wheated profile tied to one of bourbon's coolest comeback stories. And Weller 107, well, that's the closest thing to Pappy without actually being Pappy. If you enjoyed this deep dive, hit like, subscribe, ring that bell, and stick around, because every week we explore bourbon history, industry secrets, and some of the best bottles you can actually find. And don't forget, my bourbon mystery novel, The $1 Million Barrel, is coming soon, so if you love the stories behind the whiskey, you're not going to want to miss that. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next pour. Cheers.